Hello and welcome to another episode of Real Food Recovery. I am so happy to be here with you guys. Today we are tackling a very, very interesting topic. We've titled it Making Friends with Your Mistakes. So we're going to dive into how to do that and what that really means here in a moment. But first, I'll say hello to Paige, my partner.
Hi, nice to see you. Glad to be here. This is a great topic. I'm glad we're discussing it.
It is a great topic. And I just want to be very clear. As far as the podcast is concerned, and a lot of the podcast creation, Paige does a lot of the heavy lifting. I don't know that has less on her plate than me, but I think she's better at balancing everything on her plate than I am. So she finds time, she finds time to create and write a lot of the podcast content that we have. So I'm deeply grateful. This does not just get pulled out of thin air. And you're going to hear a story little later in the podcast about why Paige is so disciplined around being prepared.
Mhm.
So that shed a lot of light, and I'm deeply grateful to that professor because it sets us both up for success. We have a great topic today. Again, it's one I think everyone suffers from in some way, shape, or form. They struggle with mistakes, and it's closely connected to people suffering from addiction or obsession around behaviors that they don't want to do anymore.
Mhm.
Today, we're going to talk about how mistakes affect us, and our goal is to reframe mistakes into opportunities for growth. For people who suffer from addiction and for those who are deep in denial of it, poor decisions are a constant companion along our path. These decisions, at least for me, are always followed by shame and regret and embarrassment. And I've heard from many others that I work with that is also true. So, how do we begin to dig out of this vicious cycle?
I that's such a great question because it seems overwhelming to people when you're in it, right? You're like, I'll never figure this out. It's too dark, it's too heavy, I'm too confused. But I love the one liner that we either win or we learn. That has always stuck with me, and I've never forgotten it. So where I start is by looking for the lesson in the situation and how can I avoid this happening again? Because it wasn't fun the first time. I certainly don't want to repeat it. But Jamie, how do you look at mistakes?
Yeah, so when I grew up, I was never taught the growth mindset. I wish that I knew who Carol Dweck was when I was 10 years old. She was, the sort of the grandmother of the growth mindset movement.
Mhm.
It was researcher behind the identification of this whole, thought leadership of around growth mindsets and how we need to stumble along the path. That's how we grow.
Mhm.
Um, it was very black and white for me that you either succeeded or you failed, and good people succeeded and bad people failed. That was the
Mhm.
belief that I had. And every time I failed, it just reinforced that I was not deserving, bad, unworthy person.
Mhm.
Um, so I looked at mistakes that I made as threats, threats to my
Mhm.
self-worth, threats to my identity, threats to my comfort and value in the world, threats to my acceptance and validation from others. They were just threats across the board. So that, of course, embodied inside of me this little part of person that I was. It embodied this characteristic of perfectionism that I didn't understand at the time. I just thought was me wanting to do a good job, but it really was perfectionism. And it also embodied this fear of failure and this fear of making mistakes, for in exchange for losing love, right? So mistakes were a way for me to lose love or acceptance from others, and that was just like the worst thing ever.
Mhm.
And I have something that, when I think about the mistakes that I've learned from, that's been a much more rewarding experience than it was beating myself up after mistakes
Mhm.
as I grew up. Another question that comes up is there's so much pressure to be perfect in our society. Does that cause you to fear making a mistake? Do you feel you have to be perfect all the time? And if so, where does that thought come from? So I just explained my experience. Paige, what about you?
I, I there is pressure to be perfect, whether you're at the gym or preparing meals or the family picture or whatever. There is a lot of societal pressure to be perfect in everything you do and how you look and just everything. Um, I fortunately, I think I've got a myopic view, a close-up view of just, I can see things pretty clearly for what they are. And so I appreciate that I can recognize things for what they are. So I'm able to put things in proper perspective when it comes to that. That wasn't always the case. That took some practice, but over time and age and wisdom and experience, you can see that it just needs to be put, the emphasis needs to be put where it needs to be appropriately. Otherwise, you're going to make yourself crazy.
Yeah.
And fortunately, mistakes are valuable information and they keep us moving forward. But for some, they can be stumbling blocks and we get stuck with labeling ourselves by our mistakes. Jamie, have you fallen victim to allowing your mistakes to literally name who you are? I think I've escaped that one a little bit, but what about you?
Yes, unfortunately, that is something that I would really like. As I said earlier, I showed up in a way, in response to my mistakes, in a way that was very it affirmed that my behaviors were tied to my worth. Very much so. That I was all of my behaviors indicated my worth. And if I had good behaviors, I was worthy. And if I had bad behaviors, I wasn't. That was reinforced for me in how I grew up and in the folks that I grew up around. That was reinforced in the family of origin that I have. And I also believe that it was reinforced in the religion or the faith of origin that I had in my understanding of it.
Right.
Not to say it was enforced in my religion, but in my understanding of it,
Mm-hmm.
the way it was taught to me and the way I internalized it. I think that was all part of it.
Interesting. And I have to say, before we started this podcast, I had no idea what we were doing from a technical stance. I have a friend who says his dad always says that you've got more guts than brains. And that fit me well going into this, which brings up the point, how often are we paralyzed or procrastinating something we want to do out of fear of making the wrong move? I know I can be guilty of that because I'm not sure what to do, so I just stand still and do nothing. And where does that mentality come from? I always try and think, what's the worst thing that can happen here? So I start doing a little self-talk. Jamie, did you have any of these fears before we blindly jumped straight into the deep end? Although you are tech savvy and maybe that had brought you some comfort and confidence. I was not, but
Yeah.
did you feel any type of way before we just jumped straight in?
No, no. Well, I really wasn't worried about the technical side of it. Probably because the very, very first meeting we ever had was with our
Podcast.
technical partner.
Mm-hmm.
Was with our tech partner who does all of our intros and outros and all of the editing we do. So and by the way, we don't have to do a lot of editing because we're pretty awesome, but we're grateful for the editing that he does do. Shout out to Troy of Troy Trussell Media.
That's right.
Check him out. Check him out. But we so that I know because I figured between Troy's guidance and we were both, I knew we were both smart people. I wasn't really concerned. And I was also grateful to share the load. When I was thinking of doing a podcast on my own, which
Right.
I stopped thinking about it once I realized the load that you have to bear as a single podcaster, uh, trying to work a full-time job and have a family life, it just wasn't something I was able to do. So knowing that we were doing it together was a help. And I used to completely be caught in the trap of thinking I was living embodiment of the worst thing I ever did. And
Mm-hmm.
that's something that I want to kind of transition to because there's being afraid of mistakes when you're trying something new. And then there's the fear of mistakes that we all have, or the fear of the ramifications or the labeling or living with the shame of a mistake that we've made. So I
Mm-hmm.
want to transition from fear of mistakes before to transitioning to owning and coming out as a better person from the mistakes that we have made. And sometimes we make big, colossal, life-changing mistakes. And I definitely have owned some of those. All of them are connected to my addiction and the years that I lived in the addiction and the mistakes that I made during it. And I would say that as I, one of, I've talked about this on the podcast before. One of the things that I've really learned from um, in my addiction is how it can destroy relationships, and it absolutely
Mhm.
destroyed my first marriage. Not just living in the addiction, because I believe we were both in addiction. Um, I at the time it was so both of us were choosing other things over each other, but I had also by that point lost a bunch of weight, thought I was, you know, big news, and decided that it would be fun to just explore all these opportunities that were coming my way all of a sudden from life and media and other people. And I just thought, oh, I'm just going to go and do all these things, because I really had never done anything before. I had never had these life experiences before, before marriage. And one of those things that I spread my wings into was something that was a growth opportunity for me, but it led me into an emotional affair with another person. And that emotional affair eventually, after separation, turned physical. But the affair absolutely led to the demise of the marriage. And of course, the marriage was heading down that track before another person ever entered the picture, because
Mhm.
there was so much of us both choosing um, other things except, before the marriage.
Mhm.
And I wore that scarlet letter, like I wore it, as this huge rock, this huge burden that I carried around with me all for years after. And it was this thing that was this cloud over me for many, many years. And I ended up, it was probably maybe 5 years later that I was visiting with family who live in North Carolina, and my cousin, she and I are very close, and we were talking about some things, and she'd known, it was 5 years post divorce. She knew just high level what had happened with the divorce, but she never judged. And I just told her, I said, I've got this like deep shame around this decision that I made, and I can't believe I did it. I don't know who I was. I don't know what I was thinking. And she just looked at me and she's like, so big deal, you made a mistake. What'd you learn? And I just looked at her like, what? This mistake is supposed to define me. This mistake is supposed to condemn me for the rest
Mhm.
of my life from receiving love from anyone, anywhere.
Mhm.
Like, I looked at her like, are you crazy? It can't be that
Mhm.
simple.
Mhm.
And, she's raised two beautiful, successful young women. She's raised, been in a family that's given her the same. And so to have her just look at me like, yeah, so what? It's a mistake. And it was a total paradigm shift,
Yeah.
like a light switch. And at that point, I'm like, okay, well, obviously I learned, that those that seeking comfort from others is certainly not a way to be in a marriage, but also seeking acceptance or validation from others, period, is not something a path that's sustainable for me in life. So it was, I learned two different things in two different ways, and it was the foundation for me as I began to get out and start thinking about dating again, that it allowed me to understand the importance of the covenant that I was making if I did want to get married,
Yeah.
and understand the importance that I needed to prioritize the partnership and the marriage that I had over everything else, including my own selfish fear-based needs.
Mhm.
How about you?
Yeah, yeah, I heard a saying the other day that each of us is more than the worst thing that we've ever done, which was helpful to hear. I love that. And as long as we are willing to do the work to bring our lives back in line with our values, then I look at it as growth and progress. So, thinking about your story, obviously you're where you are today because that mistake, you were willing to look at it and glean growth and progress from it. And quite frankly, how many things in life are truly unforgivable? I think back to some of my biggest lessons uh, that take me clear back to college. When I was in nursing school, I was trying to skate by. I was bright enough that things came easy for me in school, but now that I was in a much higher level of learning, it took more effort than I had practiced in giving. So I remember specifically on one of my early clinical days when I was less than prepared, trying to skate by, that it finally caught up to me. Our instructor would go around from room to room when we were working with our patients that day. We were just assigned one patient for the whole day, and she would go from each student's room and check on them and see how they were doing, as well as have questions for us about our patients and their disease process, which we were supposed to go the night before and study all about these patients to understand their disease process, their medications, what type of therapies they were on. So we were the best prepared not to hurt anybody the next day, especially as students. So I spent most of the day hiding in linen closets when I saw her coming or acting too busy, can't talk right now. And whenever she would pop her head in the room, just can't talk to you right now, so busy. But by the end of the day, I had to face the piper. And when my teacher finally caught up to me, and by the way, a side note, I loved, her name was Lois. Lois Smart, I think was her name. I loved her and admired her so much, which only compounded the situation, which I'm getting ready to tell you. She was really my favorite, just a gem of a human being. Anyway, I could see that she could see I was not prepared to an acceptable level. And so when she was questioning me, she said 3 words that literally changed my life. She just said very kindly, "I'm very disappointed." It took me to my knees on the inside to think that I was a disappointment to someone I admired so much, or just as a human being that I was subpar. And she was so nice. That made it 100 times worse that she was so kind to me when she said it. It crushed my soul. There is nothing that could have ever been said to me that would have affected me more on a deeper level than being a disappointment. The pain was down to my core. I was humiliated, and I had a decision to make at that time. That demoralizing moment filled me with such embarrassment of myself that it would energize change that would affect me 40 years later. It affects me to this day. It changed my future, and I give 110% now in everything I do. I want to live in integrity and be honorable in my work and feel proud of my efforts. I
Yes.
always make sure I'm prepared. I learned at that moment that it is easier to put the time in to live in honor, to be trustworthy, to be respectful, and to make sure I am educated. It's literally easier to do the work than to clean up the mess afterwards. I learned that being lazy and trying to glide by is actually the hardest path that you are ever going to take. So discovering early how self-respect is earned has paid countless dividends that have protected me time and time again throughout my career. I chose to really start applying myself, and in the process found out what I'm made of. And I'm capable of accomplishing a lot. I turned into a really great A student, and it wasn't even that hard when you start applying yourself. So
Right.
I'm thankful for that pivotal moment back in 1986. I looked for that teacher. After that, when I was so prepared, I couldn't wait for her to come find me. I would be looking for her thinking, am I next? Am I next? Because I was ready with the answers. I wanted to tell her everything I knew. I was so enthusiastic about my experience. It literally changed me. And I finished my schooling with flying colors.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that when and this is a lesson I've learned in recovery, and for so many years, I would put professors, teachers as this sort of this higher power that I
Hmm.
would want to fulfill their demands or fulfill their requirements for
Yeah.
whatever it was that they put in front of their students. And that was something that was very, very easy for me to um, want to ascribe to because or aspire to because they were essentially my higher power for the semester or for the year.
Yeah.
Um, and the same would go for me with my mom. I really wanted to aspire to fulfill my mom's wishes of me because I had a lot of respect for her, and I really deeply valued her love and approval. I can't say that about all the caregivers in my life, but it's interesting as I began to really grow in recovery, I realized that so much of what I um, look to others from a higher power perspective. Excuse me.
Bless you. Yeah. Take a drink. That's that always happens.
Thank you. So much of what I looked to others for approval, I really needed to, once I would found my way into recovery, look to God to, God is the God of my understanding, to realize that if I had the same approach to God and to wanting to fulfill his desires of me and his requirements of me or his guidelines for me, that I would have had a much more smooth path. So again, one of the gifts of recovery for me was transferring this sort of aspiration to people around different behaviors that I adopted, transferring it to God
Hmm.
and realizing that I could have the same behaviors in a bigger way all the time. It didn't need to come from a human, and that really put me on a really really good path. One of the beautiful things that we learn from mistakes is viewing them as positive experiences that can help us increase our confidence and free us from the fear of failure.
Hmm.
It starts by acknowledging our mistakes, admitting them as soon as possible, and apologizing if necessary. I think apologizing shows that you respect the people who have been affected, that you have regret and are willing to take responsibility. How about you?
Interestingly, I had to apologize to you just this morning for a mistake I had made. I mean, unwittingly, didn't mean to, but the something just came up in our recovery group, and I made a mistake. I gave Jamie some information that was incorrect because I hastily misread something, and there was a few chain of events after that. And I realized my mistake this morning. And as soon as it came up, I did apologize because I wanted to take responsibility for what had happened. And of course, Jamie was very gracious about it. And it was a lesson for me. I've had a busy week, and I'm just reacclimating. I'm going too fast. And I'm just picking up a few pieces of information out of a text message that came, and drawing my own conclusions, which guess what, guys? That does not work out well.
No.
Yes, I do try to apologize as soon as I can because I want it out of my system and the ick off of me, and I want it to make it right. But when we struggle with addiction, the last thing we need is extra stress that can send us back into the food in an attempt to numb feelings. Ironically, oftentimes our first thought is to sweep it under the rug and forget about it. But that method always just allows for it to fester under the surface. I make a joke that the living room gets bigger when you keep shoving stuff under the carpet and it's hard to vacuum around it. So
All the lumps, yeah.
yeah, all the lumps in the carpet make it harder for the vacuum. So it is freeing, so freeing and liberating to take action, a huge relief to purge yourself from, to purge this out of your system. I found it helpful to analyze mistakes, to look deeper into how they happened, and I could have handled them differently so it won't happen again. It's kind of that gentle curiosity thing that we talk about in recovery. Instead of just going with these painful emotions, let's just look at it with curiosity and see how we could have adapted the next time. I have the same approach to preventing mistakes. One example is I've gotten older, my mind is not as crisp as it was at 18 when I did rely on when I didn't rely on lists. And now back then I could remember every detail perfectly. And now I have to write everything down. After dropping the ball a few times on scheduling, I rely heavily on my Google calendars that Jamie introduced me to, game changer, and
Yes.
grocery lists, as well as set up reminders on my phone. That's been a game changer too. Otherwise, I'm lost and afraid. I have learned I can no longer trust my memory, which, okay, that happens as we get older. So you just make the changes necessary so you don't look irresponsible. My safety net protects me every day, and my reliable grocery list helps me to keep my food plan on track. So I share these tips with whoever will listen. My organizational tips are among my biggest assets by far.
Agreed. And that is one of the many reasons why Paige is our organizational living coach. She is the guru that we go to again around organizational living because we want our members, and Paige and I are both our own gurus in general, but sometimes we do need the help of someone who has an expert area of practice, and that is Paige's for sure. There are many times that I will go to Paige and compare notes or ask questions, and we have many members who will come to her asking questions and needing guidance on their own areas of life that they want to organize.
You know, what's interesting is we just had this come up last night where we have our 4 foundational branches of recovery: food or food prep, sleep, movement, and spirituality. And someone was saying, I just don't have time, and I can get the food done. That's all I can do, but I do not have time to do the rest. And Jamie and I have had lots of conversation with people around this topic of I just don't have time. It is a lack of organization and planning. And if you do want it bad enough, I can help you figure that out if it's
Prioritization. It's
it's that
prioritization.
it totally is. There is a way to get it done if you want it bad enough.
And the
So,
biggest thing that we tell everyone, I think, in starting is we'll say, okay, I understand that you don't have the time. So, that's your perception. How much time are you spending right here? How much
and
time are you spending on
I
your
also,
phone?
and I've heard you say too, and I love this is, you don't have time to do this, but do you have time to be sick?
Exactly.
It takes a lot of time, money, effort. It's a real drain to be
Exactly.
sick.
That is so true. So one of the bulletproof ways we overcome mistakes is to focus on the lessons we learn after them. In recovery, everything falls under the umbrella of thought control. So the thought and of the thoughts we have and the art of reframing them can be our best friend, or thoughts we have can be our worst enemy. Finding lessons is a key step in moving forward and working through mistakes. It invites inner peace and you can feel better about the situation when looking back on it. And that's something that I learned a lot in the 12-step rooms. I have a background in the 12-step world, not in the OA or overeaters side of 12-step. I found those groups not to be a good fit for my needs, but I did find a lot of healing in the Al-Anon world and the adult child of alcoholic and dysfunctional homes rooms. Those are both 12-step programs. And one of the things I learned was not only the amends process that Paige talked about a few minutes ago, making sure you own your mistakes if they've been committed against others, making sure you own them immediately or as soon as you can, in a way that really looks in the mirror and allows us to stand up for to others in a way that shows the level of respect we have for them. So it's not only a level of respect for another person to make an amends, to say sorry, but it's a level of self-respect that we have, that we're willing to be vulnerable, we're willing to be honest, and we're willing to look in the mirror and say, hey, I looked in the mirror, I didn't like what I saw, so here's what I'm saying to you now. I'm saying I'm sorry, and I'd like to figure out how I can make this up to you. So when I think about learning from mistakes, I always think about this great book I read years ago. It was 2016, and the book was called um, by Ryan Holiday, and it was all about Stoicism. And essentially, the book's title was the oh gosh, obstacle. The obstacle is the way.
Mm,
And it was all about what he was creating, this foundation for modern day Stoicism. So his whole belief system was really around what all of those Stoic philosophers of old thought. And we're talking Stoic philosophers like Epictetus and Socrates and Plato and even modern day Stoics, as they were. Modern day Stoics included Einstein and Thomas Edison, and you could even include Abe Lincoln and George Washington, and really some of the founding fathers and founders of industry were Stoics. They believed that the obstacle you were facing, the only way out of that or around that obstacle is you have to go through it. You have to figure out that the path through that obstacle is the path of learning, is the path of freedom. And that's absolutely true in addiction recovery. We cannot keep going around it. We have to go through it. We have to choose that abstinence. We have to choose to prioritize our food and food
mhm.
prep. We have to choose to do that movement every day. There is no shortcut.
Yeah.
So in this book, The Obstacle is the Way, the author talked a lot about how he was fascinated with Thomas Edison, and I also became fascinated with him and his whole story around his invention of the light bulb. And Edison, when he was inventing the light bulb, he had to invent this sort of thread or filament that would conduct the electricity. And they had tried over 1,000 ways of different types and different materials to make that filament. And it
Mhm.
kept failing, and it kept breaking, and it kept burning out, and it kept, literally combusting inside the light bulb, and the light bulb would burn out. And the press was getting wind of this, and that, here it was, this inventor that was literally inventing electricity and inventing a light bulb that could change everyone's world. And he kept, from the media's perspective, failing. And they were interviewing him. They said, Mr. Edison, it was thousands of different variations that this man had tried. And the media person interviewing him, of course, said that to him, like, you've tried
Mhm.
10,000 different filaments. Aren't you defeated? Don't you feel like you're never gonna find the right one? And Thomas Edison just looked at him and said, I haven't failed 10,000 different times. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. I've yet to find the one that will. Like, he just looked at him like, what? Like, that's ridiculous. And I remember, like, reading that, sitting out reading that book, that chapter in the book, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, what a reframe.
Yeah.
And then literally very soon after that interview, Edison went on to find the right filament, which
Thank goodness.
happened to be a thread from his wife's sewing kit.
Amazing.
So,
Amazing. That's funny that you brought up that point. This week I had some time on my hands, so I watched there's a new Netflix movie out about, I can't remember the name of it, but it's about the life of Diana Nyad, who
oh,
was
sure.
the 60-some-year-old swimmer that swam from Cuba to
Hmm.
Florida.
Hmm.
And I think I mean, she wasn't able to accomplish it in her 20s, but at 60 some, she's like, I think I can do it. And she tried like 5 different times over the course of those next 5 or 6 years and had to convince people that she was really going to do it, but she hung in there. And what my point is, she learned from
Yes.
these different routes and things that happened, how to improve, and then she finally did it. But
Yeah,
anyway, yeah.
incredible. Incredible.
So I love how mistakes motivate change and improvements. I find it helpful to reflect on our progress too. I had my first big vacation about 6 months into recovery and had to face a sugar-free vacation. I was terrified and I had to go to extremes to be successful. I was a nervous wreck about it, not to mention that car travel is really difficult. And this is about an 8-hour car ride. I get very I know I've got some hyperactivity problems, and being strapped down in the car for that long is not good for me. But since that time, I've had an additional couple years under my belt, 2 more vacations under my belt. So it's nice to look back and see how far I've come. I don't have to make any big preparations now to be sugar free. So that for anybody that's listening, recovery does get easier. It's never easy, and you always have to be vigilant, but it just looks a little bit different. So now I don't have to make these big preparations to be sugar free. It's so ingrained to my core that now it's actually second nature. It's who I've become. And I've learned tricks to make car travel easy. So always take the time to pat yourself on the back for the progress you have made on your journey.
Mhm.
Sometimes we forget to congratulate ourselves. Confidence in recovery is a nice blessing, not to be confused with overconfidence, where we can let our guard down. I always lecture peeps about don't get cocky, because that will always come back to, in air quotes, bite you in the end.
That's right. We know that keeping a growth mindset can help us view mistakes as lessons and growth opportunities rather than failures. Instead of dwelling on mistakes you've made, think of them as positive experiences that have helped you grow and improve. As humans, we're wired to the negative. So in recovery, we must learn how to shift our thinking to the positive. That's just, there's no negotiation there. One of the best tools of recovery, and a critical tool of recovery, is learning how to shift negative thoughts into positive, reframing. It's a form of self-love and respect for those around us, because again, it's how we show up in the world, but it's also, um, it really helps us give to others that we love most, because we're giving from a place of positivity instead of negativity.
Mhm.
That's something that I'm very grateful that I learned about Carol Dweck and growth mindset. I remember I was in probably grad school, sadly, in my 30s when I learned. I was like, wait, that's a thing? Like, I could really do that? Like, I really I just did not know. It was not modeled for me. It was not taught to me. Because I thought I was so deeply, deeply broken that I could, that those things didn't apply to me. And until I learned how to take care of my body, until I learned how to um, start to move my body, I started to have friends who were in the fitness world, in the, personal development space, and they were athletes. Many of them were athletes, and they lived with growth mindset since they were children. And I just was fascinated by them, fascinated. And I'm like, wait, there's like, you can just make a choice. And they look at me like, yeah. And I'm like, but what if the worst happens? They're like, so what? And I
Yeah.
was like, what? Like, stop. Like, I couldn't get my mind around it. I could not. And I was squarely in my 30s, squarely.
Don't you think it's even pulling out of that victim mentality and taking ownership that I have control here?
It is absolutely, but I was raised as and grew up as a victim. So I didn't understand that that was a choice that I could make.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have a story to tell here about Jamie. We had an issue where I made a mistake on something we were working on. I felt horrible, horrible about it. And yet Jamie was very calm. And I remember her saying to me, well, there's nothing we can do about it now. So it's not going to do any good to get all worked up. So let's just work on what we can do to correct it and move forward. She was completely even keeled. I even remember the look on her face, very calm, like, okay, it's like nothing had even happened. She had every right to be unhappy with me, but she took the high road, and she had to know I felt awful. I mean, obviously that there's no amount of anger she could have had at me that I didn't have at myself was even worse. And but she was very kind to me, and she saw that if we just work together to resolve this issue, everyone would be better in the end. Jamie, does that reaction come to you naturally, or have you had to learn from past experiences that
Uh,
staying calm is the best way to move forward?
I've learned that in recovery for sure. I've learned that from you. I've learned that from my husband. In some instances, I've learned that deeply from him, where if I make a mistake, if it's something where I've, like dropped something, done something, or whatever, he's just like, okay. Like he doesn't get flustered. If there's something around him that flusters him that's inanimate, like cars or like last week with wall decals, don't ever hang a wall decal with your husband. Ladies, let's just call that.
I think there's a saying about don't ever wallpaper with your husband
And there probably is, and then wall
for a
decals
reason.
fall in. Yes, yes. So I had to walk away from that one. But the moral of the story is my husband shows me immense amounts of grace.
Yeah.
You show me immense amounts of grace, and there are people, right? Because I think I'm in a place in my life where I'm ready to receive those people. There are the people that are in my inner circle all show me immense amounts of grace.
Yeah.
uh, and the ones that don't are not in my inner circle anymore. Because I know that I'm worthy of that. That's what God wants for me. That's what God gives me, and that's what He wants me to give others. So once I understood that, it allowed me to practice that. And I know that I glorify God when I practice grace with
Yep.
others.
True.
And I also know, and I've learned this from you, and I've learned this from some very, very gifted professionals that I've worked with, that there really is nowhere to go with anger. Like there really is. Like, what is the point of getting angry? There's just nowhere to go. It's another mess to clean up on
Yeah.
top of whatever mess is there. So, and if I feel anger, if in any situation, not just this situation you're talking about, but if I feel anger, then that means I had an expectation that I didn't either realize, or was, maybe under the surface, or I did realize it and then I had a legit expectation, and that's still on me. So anger is my emotion to take care of, my mess to clean up. Unfortunately, I learned that way, way too late, after alienating a lot of people in my life, and really making wreckage of my life and in my relationships, where I would react out of anger or react in sarcastic ways, like flippant, like a teenager, not sarcastic as much as just flippant.
Mhm.
And man, there was nothing good that came out of it.
Yeah. No, it really does drive people away. And I must say, you are very gracious. Whenever we've had any issues, you are very gracious to own whatever part. I think we both do a good job of doing that. So we work well together. As we can see, mistakes can be our best friend, which was why we titled that this episode that way. If handled correctly, they can turn shame into self-growth and lessons that will last a lifetime. Mistakes may get you further faster than just coasting along in life. It's an opportunity for self-reflection and showing yourself what you are made of when the chips are down. So really, no such thing as mistakes, only options for improvement. The beautiful takeaway is that when we are willing to connect with ourselves, that means we are more likely to be connected with others, which is what we want in our lives. Then we have more opportunities to show love and caring, which one is one of the greatest payoffs in recovery.
Absolutely. So, a very important episode, really important episode. So many people that we see come into recovery, come into our program of recovery, and they come in and they're filled with shame and they're filled with regret and they're filled with self-condemnation. And they come in again and again this way. And that is one of the reasons they're eating, one of the many reasons they're using food or they're obsessing about food. They're trying to control something that everything else feels out of control in their life. And when we take the time to kind of explain that mistakes are actually failure is feedback. That's it.
Yes.
Failure is feedback. Failure is part of the process, part of the journey. It's a game changer for every single person we work with that comes into our group and we do this work with them. And we are also very, very open about our own failures, our own, ball drops in our recoveries, so that we can be examples for them in all ways, not just look at what we've done, but hey, look at how we stumbled and what we've done with it. So it's both. So really good listener questions here today. First question, what scares me most about making mistakes is how other people will view me. Does that make sense? So yes, absolutely it makes sense that this whole perfectionist tendency, or maybe, you lean towards perfectionism, because you are afraid of losing validation from others, or not getting validation from others. Totally understandable. But this is where the art of reframing comes in. We have to reframe. Instead of fearing how other people will view us, look at it as an opportunity for people to see how we handle messy situations. If our lens is really on others, okay? So bear with me for 1 second, because we can, if we want to get others' approval, we can come out looking better than before, because they will see how we handle a bad situation that maybe we created. Again, it's allowing us to correct any wrongdoings, make an amends, follow up with the I'm sorry. And not only the words, right? So that's why I love that the word, amends, because I'm sorry are just two words. They really do not attach to a behavior. Amends is corrected behavior.
Right.
Amends starts with I'm sorry and how can I make it up to you, and then actually goes to execute on making up to that person or situation whatever they did wrong. So it's changed behavior. That's why it's so important. Making mistakes is part of life. The minute we step out of bed in the morning, there's lots of options to make mistakes, and we're human. And that's all part of it. That's all part of it. The other thing I want to add here is, when we're so worried about what other people think of us, we lose sight of what we think of ourselves. If we're trying to people please others, it really is, and I don't mean to label you. This is one of my favorite phrases, but people pleasing is a fool's errand.
Yeah.
There is nothing that we can truly do to please another person, because we haven't lived their life. We don't have their lens on the world. We don't share their experiences or their highs, lows, and everything else that they've done in their life. We don't have any idea what they're thinking and what they've gone through. That shapes the way they view the world. So Paige's lens is purple and my lens is orange. I can never view life through Paige's lens because I'm not Paige. She can never view life through my lens because she's not me. And so for me to try to please Paige or please anyone is really just a waste of time. What I focus on instead is pleasing God, is aligning to my personal values, and it's saying, okay, at the end of the day, have I looked at everything that I've done today? And if there's something that bothers me, do I need to make an apology and change my behavior? And then I own that as soon as I can. And where other people think of me really is, it's none of my business, but it is something that I need to just let go of and just send it on down the river. Not my problem.
Yeah. The second one is, doesn't making mistakes make me a failure? Well, making a mistake is not the same as failing. Failure is a result of a wrong action, whereas a mistake is usually the wrong action. So when you make a mistake, you can learn from it and fix it, whereas you can only learn from failure. And it is never a failure if you learn and grow. It helps by asking yourself these questions. I'm big on asking questions to pull out answers. You can ask yourself, what was I trying to do? What went wrong? When did it go wrong? Why did it go wrong? What can I do differently the next time? Asking questions till you get to the root cause can help you protect yourself moving forward.
That's right. Yes. My husband is a mechanical engineer, and he studies root cause analysis. So many, I mean, physicians do it, engineers do it. It's just part of, and nurses. It's part of the world of engineering and science. And when he does a root cause analysis, those are the questions that he asks. He asks, his team. He asks himself when he has to understand why a failure happened. And the same thing can be practiced in life. Last question. What if I make a mistake that I can't make up for and someone won't forgive me? Well, funny you should ask that, because that can happen. That can happen. Unfortunately, this is part of life, and this is what we signed up for when we chose to live in this body and walk this
Yeah.
life. When
Mhm.
this happens, all we can do is really just right our wrongs. That is the best we can do, is to do our best, apologize, commit to change, right? Because an apology is only half of it, or maybe even 10%. The other 90% is changed behavior. Explain your plan moving forward so it doesn't happen again, and allow them the time to work through it, right? So if other people are disappointed, or if other people are resentful or angry or hurt, allow them the time to work through it without pressuring them to forgive you, because it's that forgiveness is for them, not for you. And then I will encourage anyone who's beating themselves up over something they did to forgive themselves and say, okay,
Mhm.
this is an area of growth that I have, and I'm gonna own that. But I'm gonna forgive myself, because walking around with the burden of condemnation on top of the mistake that we've made, there's no chance for growth. All we're doing is beating ourselves up. How can we possibly grow and learn? You have to accept that forgiveness may never come. That's something else that the reality is. Or they may forgive you, but the relationship might change. I know that, I've been forgiven by somebody that I deeply loved. They said, I forgive you. And then they cut me out of their life completely. I've never heard from them again, never heard from the family again, nothing. So there was forgiveness. And then that's it. So, and if that's the case, you have to learn how to accept their decision. There's nothing you can do to
Right.
change that decision. You have to learn how to accept it. And for me, that part of that acceptance came in with the new relationships that I've had since that person, where I have made a living amends to those new people by acting in a way that's highly congruent with my values and highly congruent with God's word, so that I can own who I am as a living amends to those people that I'll never be able to make it up to.
Huge point.
Yeah, it's huge. And again, paying the lessons forward that we learned, right? That's exactly what I was describing. Paying them forward allows us to not repeat them. And for those of you, hopefully all of you that are listening, you have questions on forgiveness. We get it. So the reason we get it is because we believe so much in these questions of forgiveness, that Paige and I, created a 3-part series. Episodes 26, 27, and 28 in our podcast lineup are all about forgiveness. 26, 27, 28. So check us out. If you haven't listened to them, they are definitely worth the time.
Thanks, guys. This has been a wonderful episode. Thank you, Jamie. The huge topic on learning from our mistakes and making them our friends. And if you want to know more about us, you can find more about us at realfoodrecovery4u.com. That's the number 4, the letter U, realfoodrecovery4u.com. And you can find out all about our online food addiction recovery community. Thanks, guys, and we hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Take care.